President Xi of China was joined by Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un while presiding over a giant military parade in Tiananmen Square this morning. The act was the first time the three leaders had been seen in public together and served as a powerful projection of Beijing's new might. US President Donald Trump has not taken this union well, telling the Chinese president, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." Well, joining me now to discuss this is Professor Rana Mitter, Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Professor.
Morning, Ali.
How much is this parade aimed directly at the West and US? In other words, to what extent do Donald Trump's words about a conspiracy against the United States of America ring true?
I think it's a large part of what's being put forward there. We had a similar parade that was in Tiananmen Square 10 years ago on the 70th anniversary. That was, I think, much more oriented towards a domestic audience, a sort of patriotic message to try and bring the country together. This one has really gone large on the weaponry. I've mentioned that there have been tanks, there have been drones, a whole variety of aerial displays that I think were designed in part to try and outshine the rather smaller parade that took place in Washington, D.C. Back in, I think it was June rather, of this year. In terms of President Trump's statement, I think there's a rather British thing you might want to think about, which is whether or not the greetings that we've sent had an Oxford comma after it, because I'm not sure whether the message was meant to be aimed just at Xi Jinping or perhaps actually at Putin and Kim Jong-un as well. A sense of disappointment that, having tried to woo Putin, the Americans see that essentially the Chinese are able to bring Putin and Kim Jong-un right up there on the reviewing stand at Tiananmen Square. That message of the three of them, I think, is one of the ones that really Beijing wants to project as being leaders of a new anti-liberal global order.
Blimey, I'm not getting drawn into a conversation about Donald Trump's punctuation, I don't think. But the
whole discussion in itself.
It is. It's interesting that he talked about them in this way, because with each of these individual people, he's actually had quite good relations, hasn't he?
Yes. I mean, I think the thing with Putin specifically is that for much of the first half of this year, there were clear attempts in the US foreign policy establishment to try and peel Russia away from China. It was sometimes called the reverse Nixon or the reverse Kissinger, the idea being that, unlike in the 1970s when Nixon visited China and pulled Mao's China away from the Soviet Union, it will be the other way around. This time, the Americans could pull Russia away. And I think that was behind some of the wooing of Putin internationally. That clearly hasn't worked, at least in the short term, because, of course, that reviewing stand yesterday, or this morning, you should say, really in Beijing, showed that China and Russia, as they have said on many occasions, are really very closely allied. There was actually a World War II reference that's been used quite a lot in Beijing in the last few weeks. I was actually there a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a lot of references to Soviet fighter pilots sent by Stalin in 1937-38 to defend the skies over wartime Shanghai. Might be a slightly obscure historical reference in the wider world, but there's no doubt that that reference to those Soviet fighter pilots in the 30s is being made by Xi Jinping and other leaders today to remind people that Russia and China had an alliance then, and that they have one now. The difference, of course, back in the 30s, that it was nationalist China under the anti-communist Chiang Kai-shek that was actually fighting the Japanese, not today's Chinese Communist Party.
I suppose these alliances are the disappointing or disturbing aspect of this joint appearance. The West has often hoped that China would be putting pressure on North Korea to reform or to open in certain ways. Does this suggest that actually, yes, that is happening? That's why the Xi is making overtures to Kim Jong-un in order to exert more pressure? Or does it suggest actually that kind of hope is forlorn because really they're just very close allies?
Danny, I think you have to differentiate between what's important or annoying for China and what's existential. It's annoying to China in Beijing that they know that Kim is developing nuclear weapons. They don't like that. They know that he is forming a bilateral relationship with Putin, and they don't really like being cut out of that loop. They're not happy about that. But the existential issue from Beijing's point of view is that Korea can never, in their view, be reunited under a democratic government. In other words, the South Korean government cannot be allowed under American sponsorship or anyone else to essentially reunify the Korean peninsula. The reason being that if you did that, you'd then have American troops on the border directly with China, something which has not happened since the establishment of the PRC in 1949. So as long as Kim Jong-un keeps that border buffer state of North Korea going, Beijing will let him get away with an awful lot.
And what about the divisions between China and Russia as one final question? Are they more serious than their alliance, or actually is this alliance really a meeting of minds and forces?
There are frictions, but they're frictions between friends, I think it's fair to say. Just give one example. I say if you're looking forward to where the next frictions will be, look to the Arctic. Russia is undoubtedly an Arctic state. China would like to be an Arctic state. It's put itself forward as a country that should have a bigger role as the oceans warm under climate change to be able to operate in the far north. The Russians aren't wholly thrilled about that, but I think that they will try and find ways to help China because of the overall sense of partnership between the two against Washington.
Well, Professor Rana Mitter, who's chair in US-Asia relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, thank you indeed for joining and giving us that exposition.